So hello everyone and welcome to our latest Scottish Health Equity Research Unit webinar. There are still people trickling in. We had a lot of sign-ups to this webinar, so it looks like we're going to have a lot of interesting questions hopefully from you all about our speakers' contributions. But I'm delighted to welcome you here for our webinar on the National Performance Framework and how we can strengthen its role in delivering outcomes-focused policy making. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Mairi Spowage and I am the Director of the Fraser of Allander Institute. The Scottish Health Equity Research Unit is a collaboration between the Fraser of Allander Institute and the Centre for Health Policy at the University of Strathclyde. So it's very much a cross-faculty initiative at the University of Strathclyde. And many of the researchers in the Scottish Health Equity Research Unit are also in the Fraser of Allander Institute working on other projects as well. Some of you this might be the first webinar you've come along to, run by Sheru as we call it. And just to give you a bit of background on the purpose of the Scottish Health Equity Research Unit, the focus of the unit is really to look at the socioeconomic drivers of health inequalities. So that's one of the reasons why we're so keen to talk about outcomes-focused policy making, to think about, what different policy areas across different portfolios might be relevant in thinking about different health outcomes. Sheru is funded by the Health Foundation, so thank you very much to them for their support for the unit. And it's been running since spring 2024, so we're just moving into our third year. And one of the things we'll be focusing on in our third year is the National Performance Framework as it gets refreshed, and also how it's relevant for other priorities the government has about a shift to prevention and, of course, public service reform. So I'm delighted to say I'm joined today by a couple of speakers who know the National Performance Framework well. Indeed, when I was speaking to one of them before the webinar, she described it as an old friend. And I would say that the three speakers today, including myself, have had a long journey with the National Performance Framework over the years. And indeed, when I was in the civil service before, I was working on this way back in 2008, 2009, just after it was first introduced. So we've all got a long and complicated history with the National Performance Framework, but really want to see it succeed in driving outcomes-focused policy making. So the format today is we're going to hear from both of our speakers, who I'll introduce in a second, for about 15 minutes each. I'll give some reflections and then throw it open to questions. So please, throughout, can you put your questions in the Q&A function on Teams? So don't wait until the end. Please put them in throughout, and we'll go through them with the speakers at the end. So don't be shy if you do have any questions, and get them in the Q&A function so we can go through them. So joining me today is Sarah Davidson, who's the Chief Executive of Carnegie UK, and also Hosie, who's a Research Officer at the Scottish Human Rights Commission. And they're going to give their perspectives on the National Performance Framework, the potential review, and also how it's kind of been used in practice over the years, or perhaps failed to be used as it might have maybe could have been. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand over to Sarah to give her thoughts to start.
Thanks very much, Mairi, and yeah, thank you for inviting me to talk about the NPF today. As you alluded, I should maybe declare my interest at the start. I was working at the very centre of the Scottish Government back in 2007 when the NPF was first birthed, and I've been involved to a greater or lesser extent in the subsequent reviews, and indeed have been a member of the expert advisory group for the most recent review of the NPF, including the reform phase. At Carnegie UK, where I am today, is a public policy foundation with a mission to put well-being at the heart of government decision-making. And organisationally, we've taken a close interest in the past decade and a half in the development and implementation of well-being frameworks and well-being approaches, particularly in Northern Ireland, in Scotland and in Wales, as well as examining international models. So what I thought I would do with my 15 minutes today is to start with a very brief history lesson of the past almost 20 years of the NPF in Scotland, to say something about why the 2024 review turned into something that was a bit more root and branch than expected, to talk about the recognised challenges associated with trying to implement a wellbeing governance approach and what might be done to address those, and then finally update everybody on where the NPF review process has taken us so far. So starting with a brief reminder of the history, the original National Performance Framework brought in by the SNP government in 2007 grew out of two related insights. The first was that despite significant financial resources going into public services in the early years of devolution, there were still serious and growing inequalities of outcome. And the second was that the coalition forming process in 1999 and 2004, which was effectively the co-creation of long to-do lists, had the effect of accentuating the new public management focus on short-term inputs and output targets and not on these longer-term outcomes that weren't being achieved. So the NPF was essentially an attempt to address that weakness in public policy of the time, while also signalling the importance of a big tent approach to wicked problems that couldn't be solved by any one part of government acting alone. It was an attempt in that way to introduce a more strategic and medium to long view into policy making in government. And it was accompanied by investment at the time in shared leadership development and a recognition that new ways of working would be necessary if this vision was going to be brought to life. So then roll forward a few years to the other side of the financial crash, and the 2009 Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi Commission on the Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress. And it had called for a dashboard of different statistics, which should include the well-being of citizens and how the economy is working for them. And following this, the OECD was tasked with developing what such a dashboard might look like. And in the years following Stiglitz-Sen-Fitoussi, governments around the world, including those across the UK, started to explore what it would look like to put this pursuit of well-being of citizens at the heart of their work. And if you look around internationally, the motivation might be slightly different in different places, the thing which kind of sparked it into life. But we did see in many places an increasing recognition that societal progress has to be measured not only in material terms, so not only in terms of GDP per head, but also by quality of life, by physical and mental health, and by other factors which determine the overall well-being of citizens. And the shorthand measuring what matters and acting on that is often used to describe those shifts. New ways of working began to emerge as well, and they often prioritised collaboration, integration, prevention, and participation. So against this backdrop, it's maybe unsurprising that the Scottish 2007 framework and the strategic commitment that was made at that time was widely regarded as having been pioneering, not least because it had predated this wave of post-crash interest in a more than GDP or beyond GDP assessment of progress. And in fact, looking back, there was a 2013 Carnegie UK publication predating me, which said that our work had repeatedly found that the Scottish National Performance Framework is an international leader in wellbeing measurement. And Scotland's outcomes were reviewed every few years, and they were ultimately given statutory backing in the 2016 Community Empowerment Act. Of all those reviews, up until the most recent one, the 2016 review was the most significant development of the original framework. It introduced the word well-being to the purpose for the first time. And around about this time, the then First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, began to talk about the virtues of a well-being economy, which was sometimes, even in the Scottish Government, regarded as being a somewhat separate endeavour from the NPF. And I often think this maybe demonstrated or was a bit of a red flag about the extent to which the latter's roots in theory and practice were not quite as strong as they might have been. So come 2024, it was time for yet another review of the national outcomes. And by this time, the Finance and Public Administration Committee at the Parliament had usefully undertaken an inquiry into the effectiveness of the framework. And this had provided a platform for quite a few organisations, including Carnegie UK, to identify what we started calling the NPF implementation gap, and the extent to which Scotland was no longer seen as leading the pack internationally. Audit Scotland had noted that there was no evidence of the NPF informing budget decisions. The Scottish Leaders Forum had noted in written evidence that procedural, political, budget and audit processes made little use of the framework. And September's 2024 programme for government was the first in years to omit any mention of the NPF or wellbeing or the national outcomes or indicators. So many of us, I think, saw this 2024 review as an opportunity for the Scottish Government to go beyond simply looking at the outcomes and asking whether they were the right ones, and really start addressing this question of, yeah, but so what? So in our evidence, we said, it actually doesn't matter how many outcomes you have, what they say, what the indicator set is, if these are not being used to guide policy development or to shape decision making. So all of us had our say, and by the end of 2024, the weight of evidence reflected in the FPAC response to the government on the national outcomes consultation strongly emphasised this sense that we can't go on like this. We have to either make this meaningful, or we have to drop the pretense that there is any strategic framework which actually sits at the apex of strategic public policy in Scotland. And to their credit, the Scottish, and I think probably to all of our surprise, the Scottish Government did pause at that point, and the Deputy First Minister announced a reform process, which has been going on for about a year now. So if Carnegie UK's work in this field has taught us anything over the years, it is that embedding wellbeing into public policy is a complex, multidimensional process that requires a structured framework for change. It really won't happen by accident, especially in a system which has so many incentives pulling in the opposite direction, short-term, reactive and siloed. And as with any system change programme, you need to identify all the critical links and levers in the system and try to realign them with a new approach. And in government, that's particularly challenging because there are still lots of short-term, reactive and siloed things that need to be done every day. It's just that you need to rebalance them so that those aren't always the ones that predominate. And also, this is something that happens over time as governments move up a maturity ladder. It's not a once and done and move on job. We were, some of us reflecting earlier about our recollection of all having a laminated version of the NPF at the time that we stuck on our walls. And I don't think anybody thinks that laminating something and sticking it on your wall is what you need in order to get change happen. So there's not time here today to draw out all of these causal links and levers, but I am going to outline briefly 3 buckets of things which at Carnegie UK we think are particularly important. We've been doing some work on this recently in the context of evaluating 10 years of the Future Generation Act in Wales, which is trying to do many of the same things to the NPF. And today's a good opportunity to share our findings on this ahead of publication and to see whether they resonate. So my 3 buckets are ways of working, how spending is directed, and governance and accountability. So starting with ways of working, as they say, if you do what you've always done, you'll get what you've always got. We know that decisions made in complex government systems are shaped for better or worse by a network of relationships. Changing decisions, therefore, requires changing ways of working and a strong focus on institutional working cultures, not just within core government, but across all levels of government and civil society. There needs to be support for people throughout the system, but particularly in the middle layers, to change practices and approaches if you want outcomes to change. There also needs to be a different kind of dialogue and relationship with citizens, with different parts of the sector and across sectors. So that 2007 aspiration in Scotland to some greater parity of esteem and parity of contribution between central and local government and the third sector needs to be revivified. And this all requires ongoing behaviour change within institutions and practices and a commitment to embracing the risks inherent in that. And then resources, we all know that how money is allocated and how it moves around the system is often one of the key things that influences culture. So cultural shifts are often therefore likely to require changes in resourcing practices, both within cyclical budgetary processes and in how we approach everyday spend. If we're going to ask part of the system to support growth in capacity and capability elsewhere, we need to be realistic about allocating the necessary resource to make that happen. There has been time in the past, in the early days, when this was prioritised in Scotland, but there's also been times when a tiny team has been expected to lead public sector service transformation at scale, and that's just not realistic. Similarly, national outcomes don't realise themselves. They come about as a result of informed strategic investment in those programmes and activities which will start to shift the dial. Unless a well-being perspective is embedded in budget setting processes, and unless spending is directly linked to the long-term goals, then there's a risk, or maybe a likelihood, that you won't be funding the work that's actually going to drive that shift. This is challenging everywhere, no one's cracked it, but some countries have started to make progress with things like well-being cost-benefit analysis, budget tagging, and early intervention frameworks, which start to try to align resource decisions with long-term policy aspirations. And then governance. Much of the critique of the NPF implementation to date has touched on governance in some shape or form. We know that particularly in complex bureaucratic organisations, and possibly particularly in the public sector, governance plays a significant role in achieving cultural change in the ways of resource allocation, for good or for ill. We've published at Carnegie UK in the past about the importance of getting the balance of hard and soft powers right. So while the edge matters, it has to be felt. Encouragement and collaboration can also have a significant influence. As things currently stand, the formal scrutiny approaches applied by Audit Scotland don't directly target national outcomes or indicators or the associated ways of working. And to ensure that public bodies can embed the cultural change required for wellbeing approaches to work, we would say that audit bodies' remits has to address objective setting and delivery processes, as well as ways of working or the broader implementation of wellbeing approaches. Requiring formal reporting, which narrates and explains how wellbeing data has been used to guide strategic choices, I think would also really help to put this work on a par with existing financial reporting and could help Parliament to engage with its scrutiny role. So the big question is, how is the NPF's review and what's coming out from the Scottish Government now measuring up against those tests of ways of working, resource allocation and governance? And I'm going to pause and share my screen here now, because I recognise you may not all have had an opportunity to see what it looks like. So hopefully you can see that there. This is just published by Scottish Government.
We can see that, yeah.
You can see that, great.
Yeah.
Let me just get my... Sorry, has that gone blank now, or can you still see that?
No, it's gone blank now.
Sorry, let me just... Sorry, I don't know why it's doing that. Let me just... second to get that. Let's just try again, sorry. There we go. I think it was trying to do the full screen. That was. Can you see that now?
Yeah, we can see it in PowerPoint mode, not in...
Great. I'll just leave it in PowerPoint mode because I think it's probably visible.
It's disappeared again, Sarah.
Sorry, I don't know why it is. Can you see that there? Is that visible now?
No, it's black.
Oh, sorry. Well, I will not try it yet. Then what I'll do is at the end I will pop. I don't know why that's not working. I'll pop the link in the chat at the end. That means that people can have a look at what that looks like. So I'll just say something briefly about that. Sorry about that. So let me get that. My notes back in front of me. Give me a second. Yeah. So the Scottish Government has published a proposed revised framework, which is not exactly out for consultation, but on which they're seeking some further views before they conclude it following the government, following the election. And I think it's worth saying that the 2025 reform turned out to be even more root and branch than we'd anticipated. The internal work that the government did was not overtly on the implementation gap at the beginning, but it was actually on the very structure of the framework itself. And the revised proposals are now much more based on the OECD wellbeing framework, and as such bring it much more directly in line with other international examples. The revised purpose of this new framework is to improve the well-being of people living in Scotland now and in the future. And there are now only 6 proposed national outcomes. And together the outcomes and the vision are intended to be something that everyone can get behind and that individual governments can use as the context for their policy manifestos. And it's entirely reasonable to expect that different political parties and governments would have differing views about how best to achieve the long-term goals. My own view is that fewer outcomes is almost certainly a good thing as a mechanism to force thinking about collaboration and contribution beyond narrow outcome areas. We've not yet seen the revised indicator set, and this will be crucial because this is the measuring what matters bit. When we say that we want people to use the national outcomes to shape and direct policy development and resource allocation, I think what we really mean is that we want the evidence about how we're doing against those outcomes to be influential. So the chosen data set is really important, and I'd like to see some light shone in that process to ensure broader credibility and legitimacy. So then briefly looking at against these three tests, the ways of working test, I'm really pleased to see that that's now part of the overall framework. The government says that there will be ways of working, but it's still considering what these should consist of. They suggest the 5 Welsh ways of working as a possible model, long-termism, integration, prevention, involvement and collaboration. And I certainly think that's worth looking at as a model, but there might be other core ways of working that we want to argue for in Scotland as well. There's a connection and a bit of confusion in relation to the ways of working being articulated in the Scottish Public Service Reform Strategy. And of course, it's really important that these are connected, but the NPF has to lead, otherwise there's a risk that the tail wags the dog. But the key point is it seems to have been accepted or re-accepted that a wellbeing approach goes beyond simply having a vision and a measurement framework, but it needs ways of working which will support the achievement of long-term outcomes. And then in relation to resources, it does seem to be recognised that resources will be needed, but less clarity about who's going to produce these and how. There was no shortage of guidance produced at earlier phases of the NPF's existence, so I think it's going to be really important that we ask why this wasn't used consistently beforehand before we rush to reinvent wheels. Capacity building in other ways is going to be important too, but we know from Wales that demand can outstrip supply very quickly, leading to frustration. So this is going to need careful consideration. And again, I think it's much more about building the well-being ways of working into the business of usual of organisational development and strengthening cultures of learning than it is about adding something else on top. And then I think there's going to be more grounds for optimism in relation to the alignment of resources with outcomes. It's not easy, but there does seem to be gathering Scottish Government and parliamentary interest in approaches such as budget tagging. And encouragingly, the Scottish Government has brought its exchequer and strategy functions together within its overall structure. And I think that bodes well for the future. And then finally, governance. This is weaker at this stage. The published draft implementation plan talks quite a bit about narrative reporting and about strategic steers, but there's really nothing there about a more hard-edged approach to accountability. Various models have been put forward by us and others, including an enhanced role for Audit Scotland and for the Parliament, but this really needs further consideration. And similarly, while the implementation plan does indicate that some thought has been given to the alignment of public body and government strategies within the NPF, I do wonder if it minimises the amount of work that's going to be done to really clear the undergrowth of multiple strategies and competing frameworks for performance measurement and position the wellbeing outcomes and the associated data in the right place. The legislative underpinning also needs revisiting. The Community Empowerment Act increasingly feels out of date. And even if you think that the existing duty to have regard to the national outcomes is sufficient, which I don't, it's surely not okay that this duty doesn't apply to Scottish ministers themselves. And the final thing I want to say is about leadership. I often say that wellbeing frameworks are in many ways simply a tool to support good public administration. And to that extent, they are technocratic ways of making sure that what you do and how you do it will deliver desired outcomes. And it's no different in that way from pre-PM disciplines and tools. However, because of the extent of the whole system nature of wellbeing approaches and the challenge that these pose to traditional, deep-rooted political and institutional cultures, they do require a degree of visible, consistent and senior political leadership. And as we go into an election period, that really is all to play for. Thanks, Mairi.
Thanks very much for that, Sarah. So much to unpack and think about there. And I can see already we're getting some questions coming in. So please, everybody, if you've got any questions for Sarah, any reflections on what she said, please put your questions in the chat. Ali, I'm going to hand over to you now to give your perspective.
Oh, thank you very much. And I'm really pleased to be part of this conversation. Similarly to both of you, I've been involved with the NPF, not quite as long. 2013 was when I entered my interest, and I've seen it evolve over that time with different administrations, different refreshes, different waves of optimism, and at times a bit of a drift. But I want to begin by saying quite clearly, I've always said this, and I still believe that the NPF has got extraordinary transformational potential. I just don't think we've ever really lived up to the full potential of what it can do. And I also think that we're at a really pivotal moment, as Sarah said, because the question isn't whether the NPF sounds good. It does, it is a good idea. But the question is whether it genuinely shapes how Scotland makes its decisions. And that's the test. So I've got a few areas I'd like to cover. I haven't got any slides, but I want to look at just a little bit of history of why the NPF still matters. My interest coming in from the background of the human rights and also the SDGs. A little bit looking at what I think has improved, and how, I suppose, moving from rhetoric to more routine use of decision making, making the NPF the engine room of decision making. Some lessons Sarah mentioned about budgeting, and that's another area where I've done a lot of work in trying to connect NPF and budget. So a little bit there, and again back to this idea of a sort of transformational point in time. So a bit of speed dating on the NPF, if you will. So starting with where and why the NPF still matters. The original idea behind the NPF was really bold. As Sarah set out quite clearly, it said that instead of organising government purely around departments or portfolios, we should be organising it around outcomes. And instead of focusing on short-term targets, it's long-term well-being. Instead of measuring what's easy, it's measuring what matters. And then, so this 2007, that was quite a radical idea, and it remains really powerful. But if it works properly, the NPF should do three really simple things. It should tell us where Scotland wants to go. It should guide the programme for government, what we prioritise each year, and it should shape the budget and how we allocate resources to achieve those outcomes. So in simple terms, the NPF says what we're trying to do, the programme for government says what we are doing each year towards that, and the budget shows whether or not we're serious enough to fund that. But that line of sight sounds really obvious, sounds really easy, but in practice it's not, it's difficult and it's quite fragile. So too often the NPF sits at the top of a system as a kind of statement of intent, and it's referenced in documents and it appears in impact assessments, so maybe less so over the last cycle, but it doesn't consistently drive decisions, and that's where my main concern lies. Entering our work in terms of human rights, from the Commission's perspective, our engagement with the NPF began in 2013. And at that time, we were developing Scotland's first National Action Plan for Human Rights, and we were thinking about monitoring and accountability. And the NPF, at the time, Scotland's Framework for Progress, and human rights are Scotland's legal obligations for progress. So these two things are inextricably combined, or connected, not rhetorically, but structurally. And around the same time, the Sustainable Development Goals were being negotiated internationally. And we saw an opportunity in that the NPF, the SDGs and human rights needed to be better aligned. Advancing one would advance the others. And progress wouldn't hopefully then sit in silos, but it would be compounded. And there were successes. A human rights outcome was introduced. The language was improved. The SDGs were referenced. But the deeper integration on both sets of frameworks never really happened in terms of human rights and SDGs. The connections remain impartial, or partial rather. The architecture didn't change. It was just kind of surface. And so now, as we look at the current refresh, I think we've got the opportunity again, but also more risk. In terms of what's improved, the current proposals are more cohesive than their earlier drafts. They are simpler. I think, as Sarah said, reducing to 6 outcomes, I think there are some real advantages to narrowing that focus. There is a clear attempt to position the MPF as a strategic framework rather than a performance dashboard. There's now an explicit reference to fairness, equality and rights as cross-cutting perspectives, and that is progress. But the main issue for me is when you describe human rights as a perspective, as a lens to look through. I understand that's attractive language, but human rights are not a lens, they are legal obligations on government. And that still has a concern for me, that it's just viewed as a perspective and there's not a real understanding about what the legal obligations are that underpin that. So there are standards that should constrain, guide and shape decisions. And at the moment, human rights are visible in the narrative, but they're not really clearly embedded in the system that makes the decisions. So they appear in the framing, but they don't determine how the outcomes are structured, how the indicators are chosen, or certainly I'm not aware of that yet, how the trade-offs are assessed, how budgets are evaluated, and how progress is then interpreted. So that for me is the difference. It could mean the difference in everything, because unless rights influence decisions, they remain rhetorical. And in a couple of the meetings that we've had over the last year, I've been thinking and articulating as the MPF as the engine room of decision making. And so where I see human rights, they're on the front page now, but they're not in the engine room. They're not where the decisions are happening, where the real work is happening. That's where the budgets are negotiated. That's where competing priorities collide. It's where indicators are selected. It's where different or difficult questions about inequalities are faced or avoided. So if rights are not built into that machinery, then they're not meaningfully going to shape the outcomes. And we have seen this before when we look at the indicators that have been developed in the past. They are often treated as technical, analytical and neutral, which they're not. Indicators signal what counts, what matters and what is politically salient. But if an indicator shows stagnation, that might look stable, but from a rights perspective, we've got to question it from a progressive realization point of view, because standing still actually quite often is a warning sign. It's a red flag that things should be getting better, and actually stagnation is therefore a negative outcome. And we've seen that quite often where the headline indicator doesn't capture the lived experience on the ground. So indicators are not just data points, but they are signals of what the government values. Looking a little bit from onto budgeting, we've learned a lot, or I certainly learned a lot about from the equality and human rights budgeting angle. And I think this is where the MPF conversation becomes really real. Budgets are not neutral documents. They are moral documents. They show what we as a country prioritise, what we protect and what we're willing to trade on. And over the last few years, there has been some really good, genuine progress to develop equality and human rights budgeting in Scotland. And the language is stronger, there's more transparency, there's more participation, and there's more acknowledgement that distributional impacts matter. But we've also learned something a little uncomfortable, which is if equality and human rights analysis happens after decisions are largely made, then its influence is limited. And if the process kind of works like this, where spending envelopes are agreed, allocations are negotiated, political trade-offs are made, and only then equality and human rights impacts are assessed, then they're not shaping decisions, we're just describing them. And that distinction is critical. So a rights-based approach to budgeting isn't just about transparency, and it's about asking difficult questions. So are we using budgets to achieve minimum outcomes? Are we using the most available resources that we have? Are we looking at where areas are sliding backwards and making better investments? Are we looking at what works and what doesn't work in terms of our investments? And are we protecting the most disadvantaged when we're making trade-offs? And those questions change conversations. They shift budgeting from a negotiation between portfolios to an assessment aligned against obligations. And that's where I see the same shift is being required for the MPF. So the MPF sits alongside the budget as a reference point. If that's all it does, it's just decorative. If it shapes the budget from the outset, it becomes structural. So the engine room metaphor applies again there, where the budget is in the engine room of government. And if the MPF is not influencing what happens there, then it's not doing its job. So again, we can see how easy it is for framework to drift into becoming descriptive rather than directive. And I think budget tagging that Sarah mentioned, that can tell us where money is going. And that is really helpful. It helps to increase transparency and it can show tensions and trade-offs. But tagging isn't the same as decision-making through a rights lens. So tagging can describe the alignment, but it doesn't guarantee it. And I think what's needed is alignment before allocation, not after. So for me, the test of the NPF refresh seems simple, but when the next budget is developed, when policy teams are asking, how does this allocation advance national outcomes? How does it reduce inequality? How does it contribute to progressive realisation of rights? And if these questions are asked, then before the document is drafted, we move from rhetoric to routine. And that's where that transformational potential for me either becomes real or it could fade away. A last kind of main area that I wanted to look at was the local dimension. So for me, over the years, another tension of the NPF that has always struggled with has been national indicators, national progress versus local meaning. And at one point, there was a serious suggestion from someone who will remain nameless that actually we could just ditch the national indicators as they are. We need to rethink how we encapsulate indicators. And instead of relying on a centralised national indicator set, local areas should define what the outcomes mean in their context and measure them accordingly. Now, there's something deeply powerful, I think, about that idea because Scotland isn't uniform. And when you think about the things that we're looking to measure, when you look at something like housing, adequate housing means something very different in a rural community from somebody who lives in a city. What health means in a remote area where access is shaped by geography is different from what it means in an urban setting. And so if the NPF is truly Scotland's framework, then it can't just be, and not just the Scottish Government, it needs to be meaningful at the local level. And for local government to fully engage with the NPF, to see it as meaningful, local indicators might make a lot more sense in terms of how the whole framework is perceived. And that requires space for contextualized interpretation, but it also requires trust. So back to the transformational potential, and I'll go back to the positive. I think despite its frustrations, despite the history, and despite the fact that I've been having many versions of this conversation for more than a decade, I'm not cynical. I am stubbornly optimistic. I've refused to retire until I can see the NPF in the way that I would like to see it. No more than 10 years, please. But the NPF, for me, it still offers something rare. It offers a shared language that can really cut across silos. It can connect economic policy to well-being, environmental policy to intergenerational justice, domestic commitments to global responsibilities, and human rights to everyday public service delivery, but only if it's embedded and only if it shapes how proposals are written and how budgets are drafted and how trade-offs are justified and how success is defined. So only if it moves from that rhetoric to routine. The NPF is a shared vision for progress, and that vision is important, but a vision alone can't change systems. So what Sarah was saying before about changing culture and changing systems, when change systems, or what changes systems, is when visions become operational. So that implementation gap has to be filled. It has to shape habits, shape incentives, shape scrutiny, and shape resource allocation. And if the refresh achieves that, then it could genuinely be transformative. If it remains at the level of narrative coherence, if it's a cleaner diagram, a clearer set of outcomes, but no deep integration, then it risks becoming something admired, but not used. And I think we're at that point where that choice is still very much open. And for those of us who've been involved in this work for many, many, many years, that ambition remains the same. If we can make the NPF not just a statement of values, but the engine that drives how Scotland governs, then I think we could make a really positive change. I'll leave myself there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ali, and thanks for the positivity, because it can be quite easy for some of us who've been around this topic for many years to get a little cynical about, the possibility for it to become what it could have been, perhaps before, but it's never quite made it there. There's lots of great questions, and I want to get to them in a second, but just also to reflect on the role of Parliament here, just for a second. That has been really helpful, and I'll be interested to see if you agree with having a committee which is really focused on to the Finance and Public Administration Committee on the role of the MPF and their sort of contributions from the parliamentary point of view on the role it should play. And I think it is interesting to consider, what role the Parliament could play in the future. How could Parliament be structured so it's more easily able to hold the government to account on the national outcomes, for example? And I wanted to kick off with that because we've got a question from someone along these lines, from Esther, asking, well, one, would it help if government created, say, 6 cabinet secretaries with the responsibility for the 6 outcomes and the current framework that the government has published? And there is a link from someone in the Q&A box to the letter which sets this out. And then consequently, the Parliament structures its committees to hold the government to account against out of each of these outcomes. So I guess, Sarah, first, what's your view on the extent to which that would help?
Yeah, thanks, Mairi. It's something we've chewed over a bit. I mean, maybe contrary to what people would expect me to say, I'm not sure that is the right answer to the question, particularly maybe in terms of the parliamentary accountability. Not least because I think it is quite hard to get your hands around on a day-to-day basis or a month-to-month basis this question of whether or not people are working in ways which are prioritising the delivery of the national outcomes. These are long-term population level goals, and pulling them up and examining by the roots every few months is not going to be helpful. So I think it's absolutely right that, let's say, committees of the Parliament should be scrutinising and holding ministers and officials to account for the delivery of programmes, but they also need to be supported to lift their eyes from that day-to-day operational delivery, to ask questions of the minister that they get to know best and the team of officials that they know best. To what extent and how is that work contributing to the long-term outcomes? And I would like to see committees given more support to think about that. And that's again where I think the national indicator set and its legitimacy and the comfort in using that will become really important. There are other models which have been floated, the possibility of something like the conveners committee, maybe meeting once a year to look at right across the indicator set and the national outcomes. Or you could set up something similar to the Committee of a Future, which exists in some other parliaments as well. So I think there's other ways of slicing that, and it doesn't need to have the names associated with the national outcomes. Not least because actually you might just end up with a new set of silos, and that's not what this is designed to achieve.
Yeah, so maybe a greater role for Parliament, but perhaps you don't feel that this would be the way to achieve it. What about you, Ali? What do you think about Parliament's role in all this?
I think they've got an important role. It's the same in terms of the human rights obligations that the ministers need to be quizzed, and the parliamentary committees have got a role in doing that. And we were discussing this before, and I quite like the idea of a parliamentary committee system set up around the outcomes. But I understand Sarah's point there in terms of other aspects. But I think similarly for budgets, where I think all committees, as well as the finance, but all committees should be asking in every inquiry they do, what are the budgetary implications of these areas that they're looking at. The same goes for the national outcomes. How do these particular issues and whatever relate to the national outcomes? What are the budgetary implications? What inequality impacts do they have? These are all questions that could and should be embedded, I think, more into day-to-day questioning on all areas. And so that kind of mainstreaming of embedding the national outcomes within topic discussions across all committees, I think would be really, really helpful. I think the more that the MPF is sort of embedded into planning cycles, corporate strategies, procurement decisions, these are all areas which can be investigated within different inquiry areas. The more that becomes routine. So there is a role. And I think a really good discussion as part of the refresh should focus on that, and that's part of that kind of implementation gap. How do we make these things happen?
No, absolutely. Thanks for that, Ali. In terms of other questions we've got, there's a sort of bundle around which touches on your point, Ali, around local government and the way that how this can be made relevant for local government, and how this is about Scotland's outcomes, not just about the Scottish government. So, for example, there's a question about the relationship with local government, and what local government, how they see this review, and how that might evolve over the next Parliament. And then another question about community planning partnerships and the fact that they're required to have regard to the NPF in their local outcomes development, plan development. To what extent has this been considered in the development of this update? Ali, I don't know if you have a view, and then we could throw it to Sarah.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the strongest lessons from the different iterations of the NPF so far is that the difficulties of national priorities top down onto local areas, and local areas saying that's not really the priority in this area, and therefore the relevance of national priorities not necessarily being taken on board. And I think that's where the discussions need to happen, where the overarching national outcomes are then made relevant at a local level. If they're to really be embedded in local structures, I think that is so important. And there has to be the freedom for local areas to be able to articulate that and to show their, I suppose, their theory of change, that kind of like how they're intending to deliver on the outcomes. And for that difference perhaps between national priorities, you know, the local prioritization there is really important. And I think community partnerships are so important in local delivery, that is a really strong, if they can be embedded within what they're planning to do in a meaningful way, rather than just this might be relevant to this outcome. And I think when you look at the budgetary documents we've had, like the national budget, sorry, I'm skipping totally across there, but it's been sort of, you know, like in a budgetary area, what are the relevant national outcomes? And just there's been a, you know, that one and that one maybe, but there's no real articulation as to how. And so I think it's getting beyond that surface level, what outcomes might be relevant to here, and actually making that narrative make sense at a local level, I think would be really powerful for it being taken on as something that is a serious framework for local areas.
Yeah, and from Carnegie's point of view, Sarah, how does this feed into the sort of implementation gap on the NPF? You know, taking it down from national strategy to quite often local authority or other delivery bodies. And we see this in lots of areas where this is causing implementation gaps in particular policy areas, as well as that NPF implementation gap. So what's your understanding of how this has been considered, that line through to local government delivery?
So I think this is somewhere where the reduced number of broad outcomes ought to help, because I think that lifts it more firmly into that level of the national vision. And then the question of what actual activities at different levels and different spheres of tiers of government will realise that is less specified, and I think that should be helpful. I think overall, and it picks up on something Ali said a moment ago, we haven't, I don't think, mentioned power in this conversation so far, but I think there's a very important aspect of the realisation of well-being, which is about allowing those closest to where outcomes are actually realised to exert maximum responsibility or maximum influence over identifying how that is brought about. And of course, for many of the outcomes we're talking about, that is much more local to where people are. And there's a challenge for central government, which I would say has been far less explored in the course of this review than might have been helpful, which is how does it have the confidence and to relinquish some of its central control over the how. And in my view, that if the audit and accountability mechanisms are stronger, then it's much, in other words, if people are being held to account in different places for the outcomes that are being achieved, then you should be able to feel more confident about letting go of some of that tight control of the how. But again, that's something which we know in our existing system. There are lots of countervailing pressures pulling against that, and Scottish Government ministers feel very personally accountable for things which are actually the responsibility of much more local bodies. And unless we can have an open conversation about that, including Parliament and others, then I think it's going to be really difficult for central government to be as confident as it needs to be about saying, yeah, we don't have to have our hands on everything, we don't have to decide everything, but we really want to know what you're achieving.
Okay, yeah, thank you. That's a great point. A question here, which is sort of a little bit linked to that, but also maybe touches a bit on, Sarah, your comments on the role that someone like Audit Scotland can play in all of this and the accountability. There's a question here from Sarah asking, do the speakers believe it's appropriate that Scottish Government are responsible for setting national outcomes and indicators and measuring their progress? Should it be led perhaps by an independent body like Audit Scotland to improve legitimacy and avoid it becoming politicised? Sarah, why don't you take that one?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question. How do you come up with the outcomes in the first place? And there are different examples of that happening in different ways in different countries. For example, the Welsh national outcomes were very significantly shaped by a process called the Wales We Want, which involved citizens of Wales in having a vision for the country that they wanted to live in. And that is something which we have encouraged the Scottish Government to do over the years, which it has never done with the degree of openness and confidence which we would have liked to have seen. I think I'm relatively pragmatic, if I'm honest, about where we've reached with this phase of the process. And although the government is doing some testing of these outcomes now, I'm not sure that starting with a blank sheet of paper and going out to talk to people about their vision for Scotland is necessarily going to be helpful at this stage. Not least because the 6 outcomes, I think, are relatively hard to disagree with in terms of a vision that we would all have for ourselves and future generations. But as I said in my presentation earlier, I do think there's something about the indicator set that it would be really helpful to have a much more open discussion about, because actually it's the indicator set that will tell the story of whether or not we are making progress as a country towards the outcomes that we would like to achieve. And while I very much respect the views and inputs of the analytical profession into that, I think there are other people who also could and should influence that discussion. So I would like to see that much more broadly discussed. And then if that were to happen, then we might move to a place where it feels much more as though Parliament as a whole, kind of going back to your earlier question, by Parliament as a whole kind of owns and takes an interest in the NPF. And particularly, when, if at some point in the future there is a change of administration, then it will feel quite important that it is not just seen as being something that is of the government, but is indeed of Scotland as a whole.
Yeah, Ali, what's your view on how it could be seen to be more for Scotland as a whole and less something that it's the Scottish Government's?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of these things where right from the start, the Scottish Government has led, and I think it has needed to lead the kind of development of the set of national outcomes. The government is elected to set direction and priorities, and it needs a coherent framework to do that. But after the first iteration, if I remember correctly, timing-wise, is when it became much more of Scotland's national performance framework as opposed to Scottish Government national performance framework. And so you do move into an interesting kind of area where it's like we're responsible but we're not responsible, and so that's where I think there's a real risk of the kind of implementation gap. And I think, as Sarah mentioned, I think the monitoring interpretation is important. I think any system where the same body sets the framework, selects the indicators, interprets the data and reports on progress carries that risk of optimism bias and maybe being accused of marking your own homework. That the issue is not whether government should set the outcomes, I think, but whether there is strong enough independent challenge mechanisms about how progress is assessed and how those trade-offs are explained and how any setbacks are interpreted. So I think that is where Parliament, maybe Audit Scotland, other bodies, human rights body, civil society, all play an important role in terms of scrutinising that progress. So I think I would like to see, I mean, I did a lot of work this year at the Commission on our theory of change, sort of setting out our long-term outcomes and how we see our progress contributing to those outcomes. And I think that the NPF is very similar in that, that the government can't achieve everything that's in the outcomes, and no one organisation or one part of Scotland can. It is a collective endeavour, but we all need to be able to set out how we see our contributions to that, and that contribution being measured. And that will be different from all different areas of contribution, if that makes sense. That's why it's so complicated, but I do think we need that kind of, the connections and discussions at different levels of government, different areas of society, to work out how we best set out what progress looks like and how we're going to measure it.
Okay, thank you so much for that. Probably we're run out of time so quickly here, but just maybe one of our last questions. maybe about the links between the National Performance Framework and other initiatives that the government is doing. So the Population Health Framework, shift to prevention, which is obviously linked to the Population Health Framework, public service reform. So I guess what's your view, Ali, maybe first, and then I'll come to Sarah for the last word on it, about the extent to which the development of this is taking into account these other things, and the extent to which a successfully refreshed NPF is necessary for us to achieve and succeed in those other initiatives.
That's a really good question. It's difficult to answer in a short period of time. No, I think maybe it kind of delves into that engine room theme that I've been sort of trying to think about. And I think the risk with multiple frameworks is that fragmentation when there is an opportunity here for better coherence. I think the NPF should sit at the top of an overarching framework for Scotland's long-term outcomes. Other government frameworks, whether it's public service reform, as you say, or climate, child poverty, economic strategies, that they should all show clearly how they contribute to these outcomes and how they're resourced. And the key is not to duplicate indicators or language across frameworks, but to create that clear line of sight. So if a framework cannot demonstrate how it advances the national outcomes, then the connection is too weak. That would be my kind of first thought.
Thanks, Ali. And Sarah, just in a minute or two, what's your view on how this relates to other initiatives?
Very similar to Ali, to be honest, that the government is complex and we'll never be able to get everything on one page. And we probably shouldn't try to, because then there's a risk of oversimplification. But this point that is critical, which is that the National Performance Framework needs to sit at the top, at the apex, setting the context for everything that everyone does. And in a thoughtful, evidenced and non-performative way, the rest of the structures of the accountability performance frameworks need to describe how they fit into that. And stripping out anything which muddies that picture and reduces coherence and critically introduces duplication in a system that has got very little tolerance, or should have very little tolerance for duplication at the moment, feels really important. And it's possible, but it won't happen by accident, and it will require some deliberate attention in order to realise that aspiration.
No, absolutely, and like the both of you, I do think it is possible. I am optimistic that this could be that guiding light and make that difference, and I think that will be really important. So perhaps there is a good opportunity here for the next government to do that and to make this difference and to really drive that forward. So thank you so much for your contributions today. I can't believe how quick this hour has gone. We could have chatted about this for a lot longer. And sorry to those of you whose questions I didn't get to in the chat, but we did have a great discussion. Thank you so much, everyone in the audience, for joining us today for this latest webinar from the Scottish Health Equity Research Unit. Our next webinar is on the 19th of March between 3 and 4, and that's an opportunity to engage with some of our recent research, which looks at the issues facing young men in Scotland and the drivers of health inequalities for that particular group. So we'll send out a link so you can sign up for that webinar. So hopefully we'll see you then so you can hear about that really interesting research. So just left to say thank you so much for joining us. Goodbye, and we'll see you again for our next webinar. Thank you.